Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you today again about TRESA. Sure, it comes as no shock to you that our entire industry was changed from the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act to the Trust and Real Estate Services Act effective December the 1st. And that's sweeping changes to the legislation. It's also changes to the Code of Ethics. In anticipation of that, in mid-November, I rolled out a course where I explained these changes, and a number of you participated in that course. I said at that time, one of the real challenges was going to be implementation. It's one thing to know what to do, it's another thing to know how to do it. And so I didn't get into implementation. And I was waiting for the Ontario Real Estate Association to revise some of their forms, bring out some new forms so that it would make it easier to follow a template and fulfill our obligations. Well, they've done that in some cases. They rolled out some new forms, and in some cases they have not. But I find there's a lot of salespeople that are struggling in making this thing work. And so I think there's a couple of things that we need to discuss, and I want to roll out some of it today. One of the challenges is when you first meet somebody who is a prospect, they're probably going to be a buyer, but you don't know yet whether they're going to be wanting to be self-represented or whether they're going to want brokerage representation. And you've got to establish this very quickly. That's why RICO presented their information guide, and they say right at the get-go you've got to present this information guide because it explains the various options of representation, multiple representation, and also self-represented parties. And it wants you to roll it out and you find out which this person wants, because if it turns out that they want to be a self-represented party, then you can't provide them services, opinions, or advice, nor can you encourage them to rely on your knowledge, skill, or judgment. And that happens very quickly in the process. Well, you can say, well, if I put them under a representation agreement, a listing agreement if it's a seller, but a buyer representation agreement, obviously they want representation. But in many, many cases, you're going to get involved in developing a relationship and explaining things before they're ever ready to sign one of these forms. So one of the things that was really, really great was the form working with a realtor that the Ontario Real Estate Association provided. Because at the back of this form was this statement: I understand, room to put the brokerage name in there, is representing my interest to be documented in a separate written client representation agreement. And I understand the brokerage may represent or interact with other buyers and sellers, provision for them to sign it. And then it said at the bottom, this form is for information only and is not a contract. And people who weren't ready to sign a contract were often ready to sign that, and then you establish it. And it wasn't possible that they could come back later and say, no, I want to be a self-represented party, after you've given them all kinds of information, all kinds of advice that you weren't allowed to do. Problem is that the Ontario Real Estate Association has decided to discontinue that form. I called them and said, why would you do that? Well, they said, well, for one thing, it's duplication. There's an awful lot of information in there that's in the information guide that RICO rolled out. But they said the other thing is a lot of realtors are using that instead of the information guide. So we figure we better pull it. Well, I don't know why they would. It says right on the information guide that it's mandatory. But for whatever reason, we don't have it any longer, and we're left with a problem. You've got somebody, you've explained the options to them, they've indicated they want representation at some point in time. How do you document that? So I've developed a form I've called a declaration of intent, and you're welcome to use it. I'll put it on the screen. Feel free to use it. And I talked to the Ontario Real Estate Association, and I said, are you guys planning on coming up with a form like this? And they said, no, but you're free to make one. Well, I had. And so they're not going to get one. And then some of the forms I've created, at some point in time, the Ontario Real Estate Association is going to create them, I'm sure, and they'll do a better job. They've got a group of experts and lawyers drawing out these forms. They're going to do a lot better job than I am, and I'll retract my forms. But in the meantime, this is one of the forms that you can use to solve that problem. But there's a lot of other issues that need to be resolved under TRESA moving forward. One is this whole business about multiple representation. I don't know whether you're aware of it or not, but in the listing agreement and in the buyer representation agreement, both of them go into great length about various options of representation, multiple representation, and so on. What you may not be aware of is that the consumer who's signing, who becomes a client, isn't committing or obligating himself. All he's doing is acknowledging understanding. But even if he was making a commitment, I'm okay with multiple representation, RICO's taking the position that that's not good enough, that's general. When the specific issue comes up, you have to then again notify them in writing, and you've got to then again get their consent in writing. So they've developed two forms. One is Form 325, which is aimed at the seller, and one is Form 326, which is aimed at the buyer. And you give it to them when multiple representation is cropping up. And then if it changes, you've got to reissue that notification and get them to reissue an acknowledgement. How can it change? Well, you've got a listing and you're going to get 3 offers coming in. So it's multiple representation with 3 buyers. Now a 4th offer comes in. So you got to notify all the parties in writing about multiple representation and get their consent. They may have been fine about competing with 3, but not with 4. So you've got to do that at that point in time for multiple representation. Another issue might be latent defects. Under the law, the seller in this particular case has to acknowledge any latent defects in the property. And you've got to make sure that any buyer is informed of that. Well, how do you find out about it? One of the things, and I'll say this now, that anytime you take a listing, you should be using the Residential Information Checklist, Form 820, always. Now, it used to be real estate agents used the seller property information statement. Lawyers didn't like it because you disclosed patent defects you didn't have to disclose. And RICO takes the position that if you have a seller property information statement, you have to make it available to buyers. Not so with the Residential Information Checklist. So the Residential Information Checklist serves as a guide to stimulate conversation for you to find out from the seller what are latent defects. Sometimes sellers don't realize. Sometimes they don't think about certain things. And there's this whole element of gray areas where is it a latent defect or not? Somebody died in the property. Is that a material fact to the buyer? Is that a latent defect? And so that conversation will be spearheaded with the Residential Information Checklist. And then you have to document the latent defect on form number 299. Here again, when I talked to the Ontario Real Estate Association, they indicated to me that there was going to be a 299 and a 298. The other form was for the consumer, for the client on the other end, to acknowledge receipt. So the buyer, once they got the notification, would acknowledge in writing. And then they delayed rolling out the 299 because they said we're going to roll it into one form. Well, now they've provided the 299, but it really doesn't have any provision for the buyer to acknowledge receipt, and the 298 isn't available. So I'll let you know if that changes, if it becomes available. So that's some issues, but there's a whole bunch more. There's material fact. You know, material fact is anything that would affect the client's decision to buy or sell and how much they would pay. And we usually think of buyers when we think of material facts, but it can be sellers. Let's suppose the area is being bought up by a developer, and the seller finds out about it after his property is sold. That's the kind of information that he would want you to tell him. Or a pending zoning change. Let's suppose they're changing the boundary for the greenbelt, and it's going to come into the development area. And obviously, if it's raw land, it makes a big difference in its value. There can be material facts that will affect the value or the decision to sell on the part of the seller too. So you need to find out those things. There's description of service, and this is a hot one. You know, we're supposed to put down, anytime we enter into a representation agreement, that's a listing agreement or that's a representation agreement to represent a buyer, we're supposed to put down what services we are going to provide, and it's supposed to be in writing. And I held off on that because it's so individualized. One person, for example, might offer staging, another person might not. And I was reluctant to put a checklist, what may have a bunch of things you don't offer, or it may leave with a bunch of things you do. Well, because people are struggling enough with it, I have made a checklist, which you can use, and you're free to use it. Feel free to. And you can also modify it to suit your particular purposes. Another interesting thing that I did on that is, along with the description of services, I've got a commitment on the part of the client, whether it's the buyer or the seller, and what he's going to do. Remember, this is an agreement. An agreement is two parties. And so if you, as the real estate agent, are promising to provide these services, it's realistic that you can expect your client to do certain things too. So that's incorporated in that particular form. And then there's the breakdown of commission. RICO takes the position it's not just enough to say, here's what the gross commission is, and here's what we're offering the cooperating broker. Now, the form the listing form, that's what it states. I was counting on them changing that, and they haven't. So we have to spell out what happens if it's going to be a cooperating broker, what happens if it's going to be designated representative representing the property and somebody else in the office that's selling it, what's happened when I'm going to be doubling it myself, and what happens if it is a self-represented party that's buying it. What do we do with the commission in each one of those things? So we've drawn up a form to address that, but it has to be addressed. And then what happens if the buyer is required to pay the commission? You know, we've put a buyer under a buyer representation agreement. We put in how much commission he's going to owe. We're expecting from him 2.5%, 2%, whatever. And we often say to him, that probably isn't going to ever come up. I'll get it from the seller. If it's going to come up, I'll notify you in writing. Well, more and more it's coming up because the seller may be offering $1, may be offering a minimal amount, and you not be willing to accept that. Now, you can negotiate with the seller, and we'll talk about how to do that at a future date, but you may also be coming back to the buyer. And so there needs to be a statement when you're taking a buyer under a buyer representation agreement as to what the potential is for him to pay a commission and how you're going to notify him. So that's another one of these things. So there's a whole bunch of things that still have to be covered. And at some point in time in the future, I'll cover one or the other of them. But I want to let you know also, I'm rolling out another course, and this course is going to be the implementation of TRESA. So the course is being offered 2 different days, Wednesday, March the 6th, or Thursday, March the 7th, and at 2 different times, 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And as I've said before, if you're not part of RE/MAX Garden City, you'd like to come to this course, you're more than welcome to come. And I will never use it as a springboard to try and recruit you. I won't ask for your name. I won't call you back later. You're just welcome to come. I don't sit on the board. I don't sit on the board of directors. I don't get involved in a lot of things that a lot of other people do giving back. This is just my way of giving back. So if you feel that it would be an advantage, call our front desk, 641-1110, and talk to Christine and just book a time and come on in. By the way, the original course that I did, TRESA course, that was interactive, the fill in the blanks, but I will print some up that have the blanks filled in, and they'll be available. If you want one of those, you're welcome to have it, and I'll have an interactive booklet for the day of the course. By the way, if you can't make the course, but you want one of these booklets, they'll be at the front desk anytime you want. Just drop it in the front office of RE/MAX Garden City and ask for one. They'll be happy to give you one. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.